we're on our way back. And so I think she
Okay,
actually
Nisha Charya,
overall
you
did
mentioned
almost nothing wrong.
Afghanistan, and since we're talking about policies, let me understand from you. Kamala Harris hit out at Donald Trump for negotiating with the Taliban, for inviting them for talks. In a war, if there is a group which is carrying out the activity on ground, which is violent, you talk to that particular group, don't you? For example, in the Russia-Ukraine war, Donald Trump said that you're only talking to Zelensky, not to Putin. How do you want this war to end when you're talking to only one side?
Right, but there's intermediaries to go through. The Taliban, I had actually a close family member who served in Afghanistan, and I can tell you how stressful it is for American families that the U.S. military has been there for over 20 years. And so there was a need to get closure on the war. The Trump administration was not able to do that. And with the agreement that they negotiated with the Taliban was coming to a close. And so unfortunately, the Biden administration was in a situation where it either had to leave Afghanistan or significant fighting was going to resume. And so the decision was made. And unfortunately, there were American lives lost. There were Afghan lives lost. And it wasn't the best situation, but it was a decision to leave Afghanistan, and it was a decision based on prior agreements. And so that has to be done. Now, the situation with Russia is obviously very different. Russia is a very large country. It is a superpower, and it has been threatening Ukraine and other European countries. And so the strategic decision there is very different than it is in a small country like Afghanistan. And I'm sure that once she is elected, Vice President Harris will meet with President Putin, and she will push for some sort of a negotiation there. But that'll also depend on whether the Russians are interested in that.
Interestingly,
I can't speak
Nisha
with any
Charya,
knowledge.
when this was being talked about, Donald Trump said that this war wouldn't have happened if I were the president. And certainly we have seen that during the Biden administration, we've seen both the Russia-Ukraine as well as the Israel-Hamas war. With that in mind, the retort that Kamala Harris gave was dictators like you because they can manipulate you and they will, quote, eat you for lunch. Is that a very solid, substantial argument to put in place when you're being accused of being involved in two wars?
Well, I think if you talk to most international affairs experts, they will tell you that countries do not go to war based on who the American president is. It's based on what they are seeking to do and also what the reaction will be. And perhaps Putin thought that the United States would not respond. The United States responded strongly and built an alliance and has kept that alliance supporting Ukraine. And Donald Trump, again, was wrong last night. The Europeans have actually given more money than the United States to it. So it is really a global coalition. And so I don't think that that's true. I think there's a question about the how Donald Trump would react, whether he would use nuclear weapons, which he insinuated last night. And so countries may be a little bit worried about that. But certainly I don't think anybody makes their decision on war or peace based on U.S. presidential elections.
Okay. Vibhuti Jha, would you like to come in on this? Do you think that how Kamala Harris put forth the arguments in the debate about the two wars would convince the voter on ground that it was necessary and that, you know, because there's been considerable anti-war sentiment and there have been people urging the U.S. government to stop both wars, do you think that will sort of reach out to the undecided voters and convince them?
The undecided voters are absolutely annoyed and frustrated and unhappy with the unnecessary wars that United States has gotten into. And that is an absolute clear fact. People are tired, sick of it. I mean, think about Lieutenant Colonel Tulsi Gabbard has said that it is the war machine of America that launches war. And she blames both parties for that from time to time. But I wanted to just comment on the basketball analogy that Acharya-ji brought out is that, yeah, you have to make your jump shots, Acharya-ji, but the referees also call the ticky-tack fouls, which prevent somebody from taking those shots and not calling the shots falsely. We know the game. So let's not go into the basketball analogy because there are so many analogies I have about sports that I can quote you here. But on the policy perspective, the Ukraine thing, think about it. If I were I was in Biden's position, and if I found that Trump has done a poor negotiation for getting out of the war, I would have said, sorry, no, I will renegotiate that deal. But to do it and then blame him for doing what, that's not a sign of leadership. That's cowardice. The way they left and ran from Afghanistan. It's global knowledge. It's not anybody, me telling or you asking, how did US looked sick and tired. I was disappointed to see the kind of escape hatch these people used to run away from Afghanistan, leaving behind $80 billion worth of weapons, sophisticated weapon, under the custody of Taliban, whom they are paying monthly rental now to manage it properly. Ukraine is another issue. This is what the Biden administration doesn't answer. That in Israel's case, which is a winnable war against Hamas, US is telling Israel not to fight. And here they are doing in Ukraine, hundreds of billions of dollars, over $200 billion have been pumped in to support American industries. It's a very interesting scenario. And you are telling Ukraine to go win. With an unwinnable war, which Acharya said, Soviet Union will not lose the war because in a desperate situation, they can go to any extent to do that. So they are supporting an unwinnable war against Russia, but discouraging Israel from winning and winnable war by cutting down their supply chain of weapons. This is the hoax. This is the stupidity. This is the banality of Democratic Party thinking that needs to be addressed. And I can tell you this, the independents, undecided, and neutral people are looking at that very seriously. And Trump did not start a single war
Nishacharya,
in
you
his
want to
regime,
respond to
nor
what
was
Mr.
he a
Jha is
dictator
saying
in that.
regarding the entire duality of the Biden administration and, of course, the alleged American hypocrisy that people across the world have been calling out regarding these two wars?
Well, I would say there's two things to say there. One is there's no American troops in either war. So they are not American wars. There were troops in Afghanistan. There were troops in Iraq. Again, people that I know, they were fighting. That is not the case in either war. The United States is supporting Ukraine because Ukraine has been a democracy, a fledgling democracy that's had stronger ties with the West. And the Russians have shown an interest in further expanding beyond Ukraine. And so it was important to support Ukraine in its struggle. The situation in Israel and Gaza, the United States has given, I think, $26 billion to Israel. It hasn't given any money to the Palestinians. However, it understands that the situation in Israel and Gaza is not tenable with Israel continuing to attack and certainly with a lot of loss of civilian life. And so Vice President Harris is trying to essentially figure out how to get both sides to the table and how to get a ceasefire in Israel and Gaza. And certainly Israel has a right to defend itself after the terrible attacks of October 7th. But also it needs to find a way to prevent human suffering, and it needs to find a pathway forward for Gaza that's the case. And so I think that's what she's trying to do. I don't think there's any hypocrisy on the American side for that. And one quick thing, the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post today corrected that fact about Afghanistan. It was only about $7 billion worth of equipment that was left, not $85 billion. So significant difference in terms of what was left behind.